The final revenue standard was issued in May of 2014, and the standard will affect some industries more than others. One of the most common questions we hear is whether companies can continue to apply percentage of completion accounting. Well, this podcast will provide you a high-level summary of the new revenue standard and some impacts that the standard may have on construction as well as aerospace and defense companies. My name is Brian Schild, and with me today is Billy Williams. We're both on the revenue project team in KPMG's Department of Professional Practice. Billy is going to provide some insight into how the new standard will affect companies in the construction, aerospace, and defense sectors. Billy, can you start by giving us an overview of the standard?
Sure. The core principle is that the entity recognizes revenue to depict the transfer of promised goods or services to the customer in an amount that reflects the consideration to which the entity expects to be entitled to in exchange for those goods or services. So the standard establishes this 5-step model in order to implement this core principle. Step 1 will be identifying the contract with the customer. Step 2 is identifying the performance obligations in the contract. Step 3 is determining the transaction price. Then we want to allocate the transaction price to those separate performance obligations in step 4. And then we're going to recognize revenue as or when the entities satisfy these performance obligations. So within the construction and aerospace and defense industry, there will be changes in current practice that may not be significant to the amount of revenue that's recognized, but it could be significant to the timing of when the revenue is recognized. And although this is a revenue standard, there's also going to be some changes in cost.
Thanks. So the new standard requires an entity to determine whether a performance obligation is satisfied over time or at a point in time. And if an entity meets any of the overtime criteria, the revenue is recognized over time like a service contract. So what will construction companies have to do under the new standard?
Companies in the construction industry that are currently applying 60535, and that's probably the last time I'm going to use the codification reference because no one really uses that codification reference, and I just can't stop saying SOP 811. So companies that are currently applying SOP 811 will have performance obligations that's going to be satisfied over time because the customer controls the asset as the entity is creating the asset. Generally, let's say if we have a construction company that's building a commercial building on land that's owned by the customer would be controlling the WIP as the entity is creating the asset. So generally speaking, they would meet one of the criteria for recognizing revenue over time.
Yeah, that's right, Billy. But on the other hand, there might be construction companies that don't meet any of the criteria for recognizing revenue over time. For example, a developer that builds a house or a condominium on land that's owned by the developer would not meet the criterion that the customer controls the WIP as it's being created. You would have to consider one of the other criteria, which is that there's no alternative use to the entity and that there's a right to payment for performance completed to date. My sense is that here in the U.S., that won't be a common criterion that's met, and therefore those companies are recognizing revenue at a point in time. But again, it's going to be facts and circumstances driven, and we'll have to think about those criteria. How about A&D companies?
So for A&D companies, they're generally creating an asset that does not have an alternative use, and they're normally entitled to receive payment for performance completed to date. Now that's another criteria that would require a performance obligation to be satisfied over time. Now, this criteria is an and criteria, and it really requires 2 separate steps. The first step is understanding that there's no alternative use, so the entity cannot sell the product to another customer without incurring some type of loss due to practical or contractual limitations. And then the second part of that criteria is understanding, is the entity entitled to receive payment for performance completed to date? So if the customer would decide to cancel the contract in the middle of the contract, would the entity be entitled to cost plus the reasonable margin?
So assuming the performance obligation is satisfied over time, the entity has to measure its progress. So in other words, it has to determine the pattern of revenue recognition. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I'm a construction company, and here's our $1 million question. Can I still use percentage of completion accounting?
The short answer here is sort of. And I understand that that's accountant's favorite answer, right? Possibly or sort of. But under SOP 811, that's actually being superseded. So under the current guidance, there are input methods and output methods. And under the new standard, you're required to measure progress that faithfully depicts an entity's performance. Now, you would still use input methods and output methods to help develop a ratio of completion, but the mechanics of the percentage completion calculation is different than it is under the current standard.
So what has actually changed here?
We know under SOP 811, there's these 2 alternatives, which someone thought long and hard about by naming them Alternative A and Alternative B. So under Alternative A, the entity is allowed to defer costs and recognize those costs in proportion to revenue in order to maintain a consistent margin. A lot of times if companies are using something other than cost of cost and want to maintain consistent margin, let's say they're using labor hours, then they're going to use alternative A in order to do so. The new standard will require you to expense those costs as they are incurred. This would include even some learning curve costs. So you're not going to be able to maintain this consistent margin. On the other hand, alternative B under SOP 811 actually dictates that you calculate revenue based on cost incurred plus a margin. And although you may achieve the same answer under the new standard and may achieve the similar results, the standard does not calculate revenue based on margin. So the focus is purely on ensuring that revenue depicts the entity's performance.
So Billy, real quick, you said in alternative A, an entity may not be able to maintain a consistent margin. Mm-hmm. Will there be a method they can apply to maintain a consistent margin?
As long as a company is applying a cost-to-cost measure, then they will be able to maintain a consistent margin just by the mechanics of the calculation. Now, we would expect many companies to measure progress using some type of input method like cost-to-cost, but cost-to-cost is not required, and it may not actually faithfully depict the entity's performance for all entities. If an entity would use cost-to-cost or any other measure of performance, there going to be a lot of judgment in trying to determine that appropriate measure of progress.
Okay. Along the lines of measures of progress, let's say I'm an aerospace and defense company. Can I still use units produced or units delivered to recognize revenue?
I'm going to say the short answer. The answer is no, unless you have your WIP or finished goods is going to be immaterial, and that really wouldn't be typical. So because the asset is continuously transferred to the customer, you will not have WIP or finished goods inventory on your balance sheet. So ignoring WIP and finished goods as you measure your progress, such as units produced or units delivered, wouldn't faithfully depict your performance to the customer.
How about other adjustments to your measure of progress?
If a company is using the input method, an adjustment to input methods may be necessary if these costs don't depict the entity's performance for transferring those goods or services to the customer. Let's say, for instance, if you have significant inefficiencies are actually excluded from your cost-to-cost calculation because they do not depict the entity's performance. On the other hand, if you have significant uninstalled materials that are not proportionate to the entity's performance, you would recognize revenue. However, revenue would be recognized to the extent of cost, so you would recognize zero margin. And this is only happening if certain conditions are met.
Okay. How about changes with respect to contract modifications?
One of the things that's common in the construction and aerospace and defense industry are follow-on orders. So currently, the unit of account is typically the entire contract. But under the new standard, a company will need to determine if follow-on orders represent new contracts or modification of a contract, which would impact the way that you would account for the modification. Now, there would also be some changes to the way that you would account for a contract modification in terms of unpriced change orders and claims. So currently under U.S. GAAP, unpriced change orders and claims must be probable of recovery. Plus, claims specifically must meet other criteria as well. However, under the new standard, all modifications are accounted for when they are legally enforceable, which particularly for claims may be later than under SOP 811.
Can you touch briefly on the disclosure requirements?
So disclosures are going to expand significantly. So there are quantitative disclosures that will be required to be made on this quarterly basis, such as disaggregation of revenue or information about contract balances and contract costs, and even the transaction prices allocated to the remaining performance obligations. There are going to be several qualitative disclosures as well. So a company really needs to think about the systems and processes and controls that should be in place in order to capture the data that's necessary to make these disclosure requirements.
So the effective date of the standard is for annual periods beginning after December 15th, 2016. So that's 1/1/17 for calendar year end, and that's for public business entities. Non-public entities have a 1-year deferral. For transition, there are some different options. First, you've got the retrospective, so that's, you apply the standard in 2017, but you're also restating 2015 and 2016. There are some optional practical expedients to make the retrospective application a little bit easier. And then there's the cumulative effect at the date of adoption. And under that one, you apply the standard on 1/1/17, and you do not restate the previous two comparative periods. But for contracts that are not closed as of 1/1/17, you apply the standard retrospectively to those. So thank you to Billy, and thank you to our listeners For additional information, refer to KPMG's Financial Reporting Network website, including the latest on the revenue recognition page, which links to KPMG analysis of the new standard, including defining issues, webcasts, and other podcasts.